Francis Levy, co-director of the Philoctetes Center. Dr. Ed Nersessian is the other co-director. And welcome to Our Life in Poetry, Emily Dickinson. Now, before we begin tonight's discussion, I want to make a couple of announcements about forthcoming events. This Saturday, January 12th, we are having a roundtable called Weather and Imagination. And the art you see on these walls is from a show that's been curated by Alice Quinn called Pathetic Fallacy, Weather and Imagination. And since we are on the subject of poetry, Yeats said, you know, perfection in life or art, and Hallie's been working very intensively on this show. So the perfection has been mostly in the level of art, where the marriage has suffered, unfortunately. But I'm very proud of her, and Adam Ludwig, who's like killing himself on this show also. Now I'm very proud to introduce Mike Braziller. Mike Braziller is the president, publisher of Persea Books. And Persea publishes literary and educational fiction and poetry. Mike is also a longtime friend of mine. Mike will introduce our distinguished panelists and host our discussion this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. Tonight, we'll be talking about the life and poetry of Emily Dickinson. And we're very lucky to have Alice with us. Alice Quinn is Executive Director of the Poetry Society of America. She was poetry editor at the publishing firm of Alfred A. Knopf from 1976 to 86, and poetry editor at the New Yorker for the last 20 years. She is the editor of Edgar Allan Poe and the Jukebox on Collected Poems, Drafts, and Fragments by Elizabeth Bishop. She's also professor at Columbia University School of the Arts, where she has taught since 1989. Welcome, Alice. And
Thank you. Thank you. We're also friends. We thought that we would start. Most people who love Emily Dickinson's poetry become almost fanatical about it. So I'm sure there'll be a little bit of repetition for all of you who know her story, because it's such a big part of, well, the legend of Emily Dickinson. But we thought we would take 15 minutes to describe a little bit of the family background and you know, sort of pivotal aspects of crucial issues in her life, issues of renunciation, largely, willful or no. There's a wonderful essay by Richard Wilbur called Sumptuous Destitution, in which he argues that the three things that mattered to her most, she had to renounce, and she herself referred to renunciation as the most piercing virtue. And that would be the renunciation of God. When she was a young girl, there were, it was a time of incredible revivals in her little country town of Amherst, from 1840 when she was 10 years old to 1862 when she was 32 years old. There were 8 revivals. Everyone in her family surrendered. This was a moment when transcendentalism was being countered by the old Calvinist world was dying down, and everybody was into soul searching and confession and redemption, and all of her friends were dropping like flies. And she wrote to a young friend of hers, "I alone stand in rebellion." And there's a wonderful, wonderful letter when she was 16 years old that she wrote to a friend. "I am not unconcerned upon the all-important subject to which you have so frequently and so affectionately called my attention in your letters, but I feel that I have not yet made my peace with God. I am still a stranger to the delightful emotions which fill your heart. I have perfect confidence in God and His promises, and yet I know not why. I feel that the world holds a predominant place in my affections. I don't feel that I could give up all for Christ were I called to die." You know, and she was writing to her friends a lot of the time, "Will you tell me what it is you feel? I can't feel that." So a big aspect of her early life was that her father, her sister, and her brother all converted, and she did not. Another huge aspect of her life is the fanatical temperament of the Dickinson household. Her grandfather, Samuel Fowler Dickinson, was a salutatorian at Dartmouth, one of the founders of Amherst College. He was so intent on establishing that college that something upwards of 12 or 14 of the Irishmen who were physically building the college lived in the Dickinson household and bankrupted him. So he ended up having to give up the old homestead, and he became a caretaker at a seminary in Iowa or Ohio. Forgive me for not remembering that. And his son, Edward, Squire Dickinson, a great lawyer who became the treasurer of Amherst College, made it his young life's business to get back that family house, the homestead. So Emily wrote of her father that his heart was pure and terrible, and I think no other like it exists. He did give her dog, Carlo. He had a wonderful library. She said, "Father has wonderful books, but he begs me not to read them." Her mother was supposedly fairly hypochondriacal, and later on in life, as she was dying, Emily wrote, "We were not affectionate mother and children, but as minds in the same earth meet by tunneling, when she became our child, the affection came." Her letters are absolutely astounding, really, really wonderful letters. So the other big aspect of her life, of course, her brother thought it was all nonsense, this whole thing about Emily's withdrawal. But by the age of 20, she was writing to a friend, "I don't leave the house unless emergency takes me by the hand." She found life fairly shallow, really, in the way people approach life, fairly shallow. And there's a lot of contemporary testimony to that by Susan Gilbert, whom she loved very deeply, by Austen himself, by Mabel Loomis Todd, who ended up editing her poetry. One of my favorite things that she wrote was, "In all the circumference of expression, those guileless words of Adam and Eve never were surpassed. I was afraid and hid myself." And there's also another wonderful thing. She said that she felt that most people talked of hallowed things and embarrassed my dog. Then there's a lot of speculation about, we'll read tonight many poems that touch on the subject of love and physical ecstasy. Her brother maintained that this girl of ebullient spirits in childhood, and who was remarkably brilliant and who wrote wonderful essays, and was notable for being socially delightful. Austen made it clear to Mabel Loomis Todd that Emily Dickinson had a few love affairs, and then she just withdrew very naturally. He thought it was really the whole legend about her, and there was a legend in her lifetime. She was referred to as the myth of Amherst, was just nonsense. So one other thing, we were going to talk a little tiny bit.
Did she, just question here, she went away to school, as I remember, didn't she try to go to college and then return home? In other words, didn't she venture out I think she ventured out.
She went to Mount Holyoke Academy.
She ventured out for a few years, and then at 23, I think she was quoted as saying, "I do not go from home." And then the word was that she really left the front yard since then. And it was a story that she lived upstairs, and she had a long string that she filled with candy, and she let it down from the window. The children could come and get the candy, and this was one method of contact.
Yeah, she loved children, apparently. Yeah. And allowed them to see her. And it is true that she didn't allow many people to see her. So that when, to fast forward quickly to the story of the publication of her poems, probably most of you know that there are something like, I think it's 1,750 poems. And it was her sister Vinnie that determined that she was going to get them published. One of the early ardent relationships in Dickinson's life was that of her love for Susan Gilbert. And some of the poems touch upon that.
These poems were not published in her life, right? She published 5 or 6 in her life.
7 poems.
7
in her
poems.
lifetime.
She was against publication. She thought it was a vulgarity or something.
The Auction of the Mind of Man.
Right.
But
And
remember that all the poems that were published were altered. So she felt they had been trifled with, and that upset her.
Right. And she, as I understand it, she sent hundreds out to friends. She didn't publish them, but if you were somebody that she was involved with or interested in, she would send them dozens and dozens of poems. I'm sure they didn't know what to make of a lot of them.
Susan probably had 300 sent to her.
Really? Yeah.
She made that fatal mistake of introducing her brother to her best friend.
Susan was
and
also,
they married.
They married, right.
And they lived next door
Right.
in a place called the Evergreens. And Susan, who was an orphan girl, had a twin sister. I think she was a twin. The letters to Susan when she moves away from Amherst and Baltimore are incredibly moving. And there are many dramatic points in their relationship. When Dickinson will say, we've reached a certain pass, Susan, and I am of this nature, so just go on up the hill and go on singing, and I'll be on my own. I can handle it. But it was an early, profound relationship for her.
Did anyone realize that there were almost 1,800 when her sister and Mabel Todd, when they went and discovered this? Was it a shock?
Vinnie was the one who found the poems,
Right.
and there were about 400 that were arranged in what we all know are the little fascicles that she sewed together in groups of 4. And in fact, Harvard published a book that wasn't too expensive. It was, I think, $200. I have it, of all the reproductions of the poems in fascicles. So you can actually study the way she put those packets of poems together, and that's a whole way of studying her poetry.
You would be studying them as sequence, and there's
thematically. Why did she put them together, and did it matter to her that one was from 1862, a year of tremendous trauma in which she produced 366 poems? Did she put one from 62 in with 74? Why did she put them together? I mean, it's fun to think about. The others were sent, as you say, to Susan Gilbert, to the Hollands, Dr. Holland and his wife. In fact, it was one of the early real dramas in Emily's life that she asked her mother if she could see one of the little Holland children who was dying. Elizabeth Bishop wrote a really frightening poem about having seen a boy in a coffin when she was little, but Dickinson wanted to move towards that experience. It was the moment of Emerson, when Emerson, as some of you may remember, after his wife died, months and months later, he went and opened the coffin to look at her. They wanted to confront those things. So now we are probably up to the story, if we can say this quickly, of the publication of the poems. Susan had 300 or 400 of them. Vinnie discovered this huge cache and went to Susan, and Susan kept saying, I'll get to them, but I don't really think there's much of a public for them. Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who thought that Emily Dickinson was brilliant and who thought her thoughts were brilliant, thought that the form of her poems was spasmodic and somewhat deplorable. So even though he was, and there'll be a wonderful biography of him coming out by Brenda Wineapple in 3 or 4 months I think it's going to be called White Heat. He was a hugely important person for her, and as most of us know, she wrote to him and said, "Do my verses breathe? Are you too busy to tell me?" And he wrote back, and they had this correspondence. And then when he went to visit her, he wrote to his wife that very night and said, her speech is the very wantonness of overstatement. I've never been with anyone who drained my nerve power so much. Without touching her, she drew from me. It had a very powerful sexual quality. She drew from me. Without touching her, she drew from me. And I'm glad I don't live near her. So anyway, what happened was Susan Gilbert kept putting it off until Vinnie decided she was too lazy to attend to it. And Vinnie really wanted to get this done in her own lifetime. And in fact, there's a kind of wonderful quote from Austen. I'll just read this quickly. He said that Vinnie was going to insist on publishing these poems, but she didn't really understand them. Well, Austen didn't really understand them too much either. Whether it was on the whole advisable to publish is yet with me, Austen wrote. But my sister Vin, whose knowledge of what is or has been outside of her dooryard is bounded by the number of her callers, who had no comprehension of her sister yet believed her a shining genius, was determined to have some of her writing where it could be read of all men, and she is expecting to become famous herself thereby, and now we shall see. The drama in this family was quite profound. And so the person who ended up editing with Thomas Wentworth Higginson the poems of Emily Dickinson, published in 1890, 4 years after she died, was Mabel Loomis Todd, the mistress of her brother, she'd been the mistress of Austen for probably something like 12 years, and would continue to be the mistress. Her own husband had a nervous breakdown. He was an important astronomer who had come to Amherst because they had a new observatory, and she was welcomed into the home of Susan and Austen because Susan was a great salonière who entertained Webster and entertained Emerson and entertained Thoreau, and that was part of, some people say it was part of Emily's revulsion from society, was how much Susan threw herself into it. But anyway, she was faced with this absolute morass of stuff. And one of the most demanding things about the Dickinson manuscripts is that at crucial moments in many of the poems, Dickinson did not indicate a final resolution for a word. She would put a little X above a word, a very important word, and then put 6 alternates. So Richard Howard, for instance, believes that not only did she renounce publication, she wanted it to be an adventure of process for people in the future. So anyway, they did bring the poems out. They fiddled with them, of course, because people felt the rhymes were too queer. But my feeling about that is that if Mabel Loomis Todd and Wentworth Higginson had not smoothed out these poems, given them titles, thematic titles, arranged them according to weather and sentimental topics, that there would have been no popularity for them, and Harvard would never have invested all that money in that 1955 Variorum edition, which changed the whole reception of Dickinson. For instance, Elizabeth Bishop thought Dickinson really wasn't much until she read the 1955 3-volume set, and then said, "I guess she's the best that we have." So, anyway. There's a lot more to quote, but maybe we should just get into the poems. And, yeah, let's do that.
Okay, the first poem we will be looking at is number 340. I hope many of you we've distributed some copies, and maybe you're just going to have to listen the best you can. Number 340, or share with somebody next to you.
What's the first one?
It's called I Felt a Funeral in My Brain.
Okay, here goes. I felt
It's called I Felt a Funeral in My Brain.
What number? 340.
If there's somebody here who has the numbers, that's great, because I didn't bring my edition with the numbers. So
340, poem number 340.
In the complete poems, that's number 280.
Oh, it is?
Yes.
Sorry.
I actually don't think you're going to have to read along, because these poems are audially very legible. Okay.
Okay, now, okay. Death. Before I just begin by saying death seems to be her subject. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, as all the heavens were a bell and being but an ear, and I in silence some strange race wrecked solitary here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. Well, to get the ball rolling, I'll throw out a few things, is that it's very hard to look for a theme or to interpret. I think we have to look at the individual words a great deal with her, and the tone and her tones. Again, I would say the poem, her subject seems to be death. Well, is death, and there's a tone of terror and suspense. She speaks well. Let me say as a general thing that it's a terrifying poem, and I think it's a poem in which the mind almost seems to give way under. There's a large weight of despair in the poem, and in this sense, she's dealing with a very, very private experience of affliction. I think this is a poem of anguish and affliction. Do you want to? I mean, you know, I think we're going to see this in the poems that we've selected. There's a repeated. There's like a great clarity to them, and yet a great level of despair or terror in them.
I think that's because a lot of my favorite poems were chosen by Ted Hughes for a selection that Faber published. And actually, I think his essay on Emily Dickinson is the finest essay. And he refers to these poems, his favorite poems, and many of them are from that year, 1862, when she wrote 360 poems, 366.
All these poems are from 62 or 63, I think.
Almost every one of them is. And he refers to this as a kind of trance state that she goes into. He says, however important for her poetry, her life of love, with all of its difficulties, may have been, there's another experience quite as important, which seems to have befallen her often, and which had nothing to do with her outer life. It's the subject of some of her greatest poems, and all her best poems touch upon it. And it's what throws the aura of immensity and chill over her ideas and images. And she never seems to have known what to make of it. And that's what a lot of these poems address.
She writes a lot of poems about ecstasy and a lot about agony. And the ones you selected, the vast majority of these. And somebody has said that there's a similarity in that both the experience of ecstasy and the experience of mental suffering of this nature obliterate reality and push it aside. And that's to get started there. That they are highly focused and highly intense upon that experience, and they push push all aside.
And I think we can understand why solitude was so important for her. In that respect, there's a gentleman in the back.
Yeah.
I think the payoff for her is, as all the heavens were a bell and being but an ear. It's an enlightenment experience.
Exactly. There's another poem that begins, "To my quick ears the leaves conferred, the bushes they were bells." You know, I could not find a hiding place from nature's sentinels. I mean, that sensitivity was there.
But isn't it a poem of mental pressure? In other words, kept treading, and then the second stanza repeating, beating. And the tolling bell, and the line you just quoted, and being but an ear, that would imply that, again, this pushing away of reality, this pushing away of even thinking, and a complete sort of focus on the world of some inner landscape, and a very anguished one. In a way, her subject, she's dealing with that which is the most hard to talk about, and I would think in her time particularly, it would be
Inner life.
An inner life, and an inner life that knows great suffering. The subject in a way in many of these poems is a form of acute suffering.
Heights and depths.
Yeah.
But there seems to be really an assertion of independence of self in really that same stanza, where it says, "As all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear." So you've got this vision of being overwhelmed as an individual, and then she says, "And I, and silence, some strange race, wrecked solitary here."
Yeah.
So she's differentiating herself and showing her, in a way, standing up to the condition that she.
But then she goes on and she said, and then a plank in reason. Reason is ego. Reason is consciousness. Reason is continuity. Reason is history. Reason is memory, and she's dropping down through those, and then hit a world at every plunge, and finish the way I read, and finish knowing. It's a state in which knowing is pushed aside too, where that's the pleasure of knowing, or the ability even to know or to hold thought, is threatened by dark forces within, and by some terror within.
There's another one of the ways I really like to read her, and I think most of you would too. I own the concordance, which you can find. It's not all that rare, but you can make your own concordance. And so when I look at a poem like this, you know, the word bell stands out for me. And when I read her, there's a sort of cat's cradle of reference to bells. And so this poem calls out to me to reread a tiny little poem which we put on the subway. The PSA put it on the subway because of the word plank. You know, then a plank and reason broke down. Here's a different a different mood, but with the same image. I stepped from plank to plank, a slow and cautious way. The stars about my head I felt, about my feet, the sea. I knew not but the next would be my final inch. This gave me that precarious gait some call experience. So it's a different mood, and you know, if you look at the key words, which I love doing, it shows you all the different moods in which she approaches these key images, and her idea of death is not always so solemn either. There's a wonderful poem that begins, "There's been a death in the opposite house. As lately as today, you can tell by the numb look such houses wear always. The neighbors bustle in and out, the doctor drives away. A window opens like a pod, abrupt mechanically. Somebody throws a mattress out. The neighbors wonder why, the children hurt." I mean, it's you know, a friend of mine says, funerals were her TV. And I think that's kind of true. Well, we should go on to
Yeah, go on. You want to read the next one? Then you're going to read After Great Pain?
Yeah, so this is another one from that 1862, and it's a very famous poem.
What's the first line?
After great pain, a formal feeling comes.
And the number?
The number is 341. Well, you know what? They're all different because they can. I think the people who have the complete are going to get the number there. But again, it's very short, and I think if you listen, you won't need to read it. After great pain, a formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremonious like tombs. The stiff heart questions, was it he that bore? And yesterday or centuries before. The feet mechanical go round of ground or air or aught. A wooden way, regardless, grown. A court's contentment like a stone. This is the hour of lead. Remembered if outlived. As freezing persons recollect the snow. First chill, then stupor, then the letting go. There's a wonderful other poem, a love poem, that uses the word stupor. And it begins, did our best moment last, 'twould supersede the heaven. A few, and they by risk procure, so this sort are not given. Except as stimulants in cases of despair or stupor, the reserve these heavenly moments are. A grant of the divine that certain as it comes withdraws and leaves the dazzled soul in her unfurnished rooms. You know, again, it's just trying to follow these poems through words like nerves or stupor or, but I think one of the reasons this is such a famous poem is that image of the nerves sit ceremonious like tombs. The stiff heart questions, was it he that bore? And yesterday or centuries before.
She's a poet of precision, enormous precision, a poet of shock and surprise and experimentation. And applying these gifts, again, to dealing with in this case, there were a series of blows and losses she had in this time. When did her mother die? Was it around 61 or was it around
No,
the
her
time
mother died late.
Really?
Only maybe 5 years before she did. But she lost her tutor, Benjamin Newton, who left when she was a teenager, I think. And he was the first person who believed in her poetry. And then Charles Wadsworth, the minister whom Susan alluded to as somebody she passionately loved, adding to the legend of E.D. He moved away to San Francisco, and there are wonderful, passionate letters to him. And then she had a love affair with somebody named Judge Otis Lord, but that was later in her life. I think she was in her late 40s, early 50s.
When you say love affair, do you mean physical, sexual love affair?
Well, that's what Austen told Mabel Loomis Todd. So, I don't know. I always, I love all the early books. You know, the first edition came out 4 years after she died in 1890. And then they came out in all sorts of different ways. You know, one was the daughter of Susan brought out a book, Poems to Susan, withheld by Vinnie. That was a whole volume. And then there were just the whole succession. It took until 1945 for all of them to come out. And then it was 55 before the 3-volume edition came out.
Was there any impact of the Civil War? This was in 1862. It was right in the middle.
Well,
I think success is counted sweetest by those who ne'er succeed. Is a poem about that, to comprehend an actor required sorest need. That was one of the ones published.
It's interesting to speculate on the Civil War in the sense that it rarely comes into her poems, but somebody said that, while the whole country was battling for control or for authority, she was battling with herself. And in a way, you could sort of say that her this private agony, this unspeakable agony that she's battling with and dealing with, has perhaps an element of social criticism in it. It's really almost to say that better to stay in your own room, in your own yard, and deal with this than, that's what's going on historically. But I think the pressures of the Civil War it was a vulgar and horrific thing, and the world certainly was scarier, and I think that these rather bleak poems that we were looking at, it's no coincidence that they were written when they were.
Right. Ted Hughes talks about the huge ideological battle that is going on at this time, that the country is facing either renewal or total suicide.
And there's none of that in her poem. And I'll point out, too, there's no autobiography, although they're intensely personal, intensely intimate. They go into the most frightening regions. They go into what cannot be spoken of. There is very little of her own autobiography in them, what caused them, or herself. So there's very little, in a way, history, and there's very little personal history.
And yet, she was much more up on events than one would think. I mean, they were very, very close to Samuel Bowles, who was the editor of the Springfield Republican, and there's speculation that she may have loved him. But she certainly read the paper every day. Sure. And when asked whether she read Whitman, she said, "No, I haven't, but I've heard he's disgusting." Well, I don't believe that. Her father had a good library, and.
But what year was it when Austin and Susan got married? When she, in other words, lost Susan? Wasn't that around 59 or 60?
Yeah, I think it was around 59.
Just prior to this whole series of poems.
And also the experience of blindness that took her to Boston, and she had to live in a room of total darkness for 6 or 7 months. And then there's all sorts of speculation from doctors, not so many years after she died. There were people staring at the 3 photographs of Emily Dickinson and saying, well, the doctors were saying, well, she was severely wall-eyed. I mean, that may have been why she hid herself away. I mean, there was, and the psychoanalytic literature started almost immediately.
I don't know if you've ever heard, I've heard a theory that if she lived today, she might be diagnosed with special ed. Because it's not that silly, because special ed kids they can be smart. They just have learning disabilities.
Sure. There's coming on Friday, you may have read in today's paper, there's the most enchanting film about a boy who has Asperger's. You've got to watch it. It's on Friday night by Lizzie Gottlieb, and it's wonderful. He's the most wonderful boy. So, maybe that could be it. But, Richard Sewell, who I think wrote the best biography, said, let's walk into the mystery standing up. Let's not pigeonhole this woman.
In this poem, as in the other, there is this curious, I think this is what imbues some of these things with the terrifying that you spoke about, this sense of detachment of the self looking at itself. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The innerness of the poems, and they're totally inner, they're not outer directed. But there are always kind of 2 voices or 2 entities. The one looking, the detached one, looking at the other. And it's just curious. I don't know that other poems
where
do
you're
that.
going to see that when we get to it completely is, I heard a fly buzz when I died. Completely that.
Yes, I just wanted to make a statement. I did a lot of reading about her, and she was very involved with the community. And she looked out the window. She knew what the heck was going on.
Oh,
very much.
Yeah.
She knew all about Austin and Mabel. She knew all about that, too. In fact, they used to come.
Well, I think the love affair was conducted in her house.
Yes. And she was up on things. But I think a very interesting study, and I wonder if you know about it, it should be done, if it has been done, about her and the Civil War, because the bodies used to come back to town.
Yeah.
There were funerals all the time.
Yeah.
There was an atmosphere of death all through the 60s.
Yeah.
She could not have escaped it. So I just
Right. And also there were young friends of hers who were Confederate soldiers too.
Yeah.
From that
Well,
town.
there's the social awareness. If her
done on her as a Civil War.
if If her
I'd be
subject,
surprised if somebody hadn't written
I haven't seen
about
it.
it. Yeah.
Maybe.
there were personal losses, and then there were these bodies coming back, and her subject was death. And to take it maybe one step further, psalms and hymns that she heard as a child, and were in her father's library, were, I think, the largest formal influence.
Well, Shakespeare was very important, and the dictionary was huge for her.
Right, but these were, I believe when somebody dies, sometimes a boy comes out in the graveyard and actually sings some of these hymns.
Right, the boys singing by the burial ground.
Right. And many times when I read her poems, I think I'm dealing with both those things happening simultaneously. I'm dealing with an obsession with the horror and the terror of death, as well as her attempt to revive herself and sing her way into some tolerance or some acceptance of some way of going on at the same time. If that's useful to think of being obsessed with something that she can't shake, and at the same time thinking of hymns and songs that would resurrect her, or that would in a way some way transcend the experience. Yeah.
It's also just, in addition to the Civil War, in that period in the 19th century, people died all the time.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, infants died, small children died.
She had a lot of cousins who died.
She had a special nephew, right? Didn't I think Austen's son at 8 years old.
So we can't even imagine how much death was around her all the time.
I agree. And why the singing of these songs, and why religion was so dominant and so important. How does one deal with this, really?
Yeah.
And if there is a psychic or a deep psychic scar with her, then it's even going to be more intense and more extreme. And this is what she shared with us in her poems. One more question, and then do I read one? Yeah.
I have a question about her voice. I love the way she uses perfect rhymes like snow and go, but she also mixes in these things like transforming hour of lead into if outlived.
Yeah. Oh,
Is she
yeah.
the first person to combine these slant rhymes and these perfect rhymes?
No, Shakespeare.
I mean.
But Shakespeare was a great model for her. She really learned so much from him.
In the beginning was the word, but every word with her was thought out, and
like the riddles of Shakespeare. She loved those riddles. She was a riddling poet, really. And that pictograph, that mosaic texture. Ted Hughes talks about that too. I think you should read "It Was Not Death."
Yes,
now,
it was not death.
Let's listen to the humor in this poem.
What's the first one?
It was not death, for I stood up, and all the dead lie down. Again, I don't think you're really going to have to look at it, because it's very short. Do you have it?
Yeah. Okay, let's go. It was not death, for I stood up, and all the dead lie down. It was not night, for all the bells put out their tongues for noon. It was not frost, for on my flesh I felt Sirocco's crawl, nor fire, for just my marble feet could keep a chancel cool. And yet it tasted like them all. The figures I have seen set orderly for burial reminded me of mine. As if my life were shaven and fitted to a frame, and could not breathe without a key, and 'twas like midnight some, when everything that ticked has stopped, and space stares all around on grisly frosts. First autumn morns repeal the beating ground, but most like chaos, stopless, cool, without a chance or spar, or even a report of land to justify despair.
That last couplet is so incredible, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's so dramatic. I love the drama in her poems, and also to kind of keep your eye on poems that turn on the topic of despair. One of them begins, "Safe despair it is that rages, agony is frugal." And she has a very strict attitude. The healed heart shows its shallow scar. You know, if you can get over something, it didn't hurt you that much. So despair is a big, if you look in the concordance, there are probably 50 poems that turn on the subject of despair. So I think it's safe that, you know, I think we can safely understand that she felt intimate with that.
What's a chancel?
A chancel is
it's in the church.
It's a church. Yeah, it's a
right
separate
before
area.
East wing of the church.
It's an area for the clergy, isn't it, or some? Yeah.
Lord's Supper takes place.
Yeah.
Because she has the tasting after that too.
Yeah. See, she's always using religious imagery. Also, those 3 and 4 beat lines are like hymns.
Right.
You know, a contemporary audience would have understood these poems, I think. I think we can go right to "There's a Certain Slant of Light."
Yeah, good.
Because it deals with something of the same. There's a certain slant of light, winter afternoons, that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us, we can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. None may teach it, any 'tis the seal despair, an imperial affliction sent us of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. Again, I think it's an imperial affliction. You know, it's got a seal, and the seal is despair. And it's an appointment that you have with this, and it's an anointment that you can experience it fully. And it's not to be shied away from, right?
Yeah. Again, without being autobiographical, without talking about herself, she's sharing a state of awareness of enormous weight. I love the open. There's a certain slant of light winter afternoons that oppresses. I mean, it. Why does it? Well, it's. There's another poem we're looking at where she's the brain. One of the brain poems. The brain is deeper than the sea. The brain is wider than the sky. In a way, this internal world is wider than the seasons because. There are different ways one could respond to a slant of light on a winter afternoon, but the fact of her awareness is that it oppresses, and it weighs upon her, and the inner landscape, her inner reality, is what her work is about, and.
I like that when it comes, the landscape listens. When it goes, it's like the distance on the look of death.
Yeah.
That's despair. When it comes, when it goes, and also the seal. You know, again, there's a love poem, which probably many of you know, which there's a lot of speculation about it. That you know, when she had to renounce personal love, she wrote a great deal about the divine aspect of life and her direct route to that. And one of those poems begins, "Mine by the right of the white election, mine by the royal seal, mine by the sign in the scarlet prison bars cannot conceal." But again, it's one of those experiences that has a seal on it, you know, like despair.
Was this poem edited? Did they take out the capitals? Because there were capitals.
Oh,
It was not.
there's capitals here in the.
Emily Dickinson used capital letters. Did you?
No, I mean, in the other poems, there are capitalized words all over the middle of
Oh yeah, she did that. The fame. life,
Yeah, but what
despair.
So that's why I'm asking if this one was edited so that there are no capital letters.
Well, for instance, the seal and despair are capitalized. If you don't have that, maybe you downloaded it and just don't have a...
No, we're looking at, it was not death where I stood up. That was
Oh, yeah, sorry.
And there's very few capitals in it.
Well, you know, she didn't treat every poem the same. She capitalized night, she capitalized bells, she capitalized marble and chancel and burial and autumn and report and despair. So there are a lot of capitals in my edition anyway.
Are they usually hers? Are they always hers?
I think they are, unless you get an old volume, and by the way, they're available. You can go to the Strand and pick up 1920 editions of Emily Dickinson, and they're great to read. One is called Bolts of Melody. There's an old book, when Mabel Loomis Todd passed on, her daughter, who was going to have a brilliant career as an academic, gave her life over to the Dickinson enterprise too, and published a book called Ancestors Brocade, and it was really popular. So you can still find that in the Strand. And it's filled with contemporary personal reminiscence of the Dickinson family. And of course that's used in all of the great biographies, the Sewell biography and the wonderful biography by the woman who wrote the Edith Wharton book too. Cynthia Wolfe, yeah, I love that book. So, they quote those early pieces of testimony, but it's wonderful to read them just, hot off the press. Whether some of it is made up or not, it really doesn't matter.
One more
maybe this goes without saying, but I think, for me, and many people here are psychiatrists, psychotherapists, psychoanalysts here, for me, in terms of just describing internal phenomena, it's just no one her equal. I mean, you might even call it a scientist of the emotion.
Yeah.
It's just no one her equal, and I share some of these poems with patients, and they're like, oh, those are the words that describe exactly what I'm feeling. Nothing I say can get it as precise.
Right. Well, I think that's very important what you said, because it is great description, but it is a very...
And they're so truthful.
They're truthful, but they're very detached too. I mean, there's a very, there's an objectifying of her state that is really remarkable. So.
So let's go to the soul has bandaged moments.
Okay. Is this? Do I read this?
That's you.
Okay. The soul has bandaged.
The soul has bandaged moments when too appalled to stir. Read this slowly, Michael.
Okay. See, when we talk about her affliction, the really remarkable thing is that many people with similar, maybe hysterical or extremely depressed afflictions didn't write 1,800 poems in the course of about 15 or 20 years, and so boldly and bravely and scientifically, to use your word, describe the state itself. And so this.
Pathologizing her, I think she described all emotion, both healthy and all emotion.
Yes.
Described more brilliantly than.
Now this one that's so dramatic, there's a, maybe perhaps a more conversational poem might begin, or a more conversational poem on a related topic begins, I cannot live with you, it would be life. And life is over there behind the shelf. So this one.
This poem is complex as all her stuff, but there are, again, many frightening moments in it, and it depicts great internal fear, I think. Okay, the soul has bandaged moments when too appalled to stir. She feels some ghastly fright come up, and stop to look at her, salute her with long fingers, caress her freezing hair, sip, goblin, from the very lips the lover hovered o'er, unworthy that a thought so mean accost a theme so fair. The soul has moments of escape when bursting all the doors, she dances like a bomb abroad and swings open the hours.
Upon the hours.
And swings upon the hours. As do the bee, delirious born, long dungeoned from his rose, touch liberty, then know no more but noon in paradise. The soul's retaken moments, when felon led along, with shackles on the plumed feet and staples in the song, the horror welcomes her again. These are not braid of tongue.
That wonderful word, braid.
Yeah.
You know, again, it's a little bit...
It's a way of speech that which you push out the words in a different tone. Braying is like...
Donkey braid.
A donkey.
Right. It's like they speak of hallowed things and embarrass the dog.
What about the sexual aspect of this poem?
The sexual aspect, I think it's incredible. Absolutely incredible. And the dancing like a, bomb abroad, and swinging upon the hours.
Does that mean, do you think, where she says the soul has moments of escape, now does that mean of some transcendence? Doesn't it sound as if the poem tries at that moment, stanza 3, bursting all the doors, there's that the soul, which could be viewed as sort of a condensed self, that the soul is not just a passive suffering, a frightened, in such a state, but here she begins to explore a shift in tone. And interesting, she dances like a bomb.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're going to talk. I think the last poem was, the gun poem. But is there some notion that that there's some danger or some explosion in her joy or some destructive?
Certainly. I mean, everybody who knew her said that relationships were hazardous for her, that she knew that they were at such a pitch that they could be disastrous for her. And that early friendship with Sue, Sue, you can go or stay, pass on singing, Sue, up the distant hills, I'll journey on. And this is a very highly driven heart. And
it seems to be either it's a very intense existence in a way, because it's either this ecstasy of the bee drawing near the rose, or this despair of the gallows, practically. In stanza,
she talks about the heart as a miser in her letters. The heart's a little miser, and the Puritan culture bearing down on her too. And the Dickinson, Austen wasn't a puritanical person, and neither was she really, but the culture was.
And stanza 4 too, as do the bee, delirious born, long dungeon from his rose. Touch liberty, touches liberty, then know no more but noon and paradise. Now maybe this is one of the few moments in all these poems that we're looking at in the selection we made tonight where some ecstasy is imagined or near, but then at the end it seems to sink back down to shackles and staples and being welcomed by the
Michael,
heart.
you mentioned song before.
Yeah.
Here, song is there's staples in the song when the soul is imprisoned again. I mean, I think it's a very clear metaphor for verse too.
Yeah.
But horror, now that's something to watch for in her poetry. That word does not appear that often. That's a very strong word.
Yeah, not braid of tongue would mean they can't even be spoken of, or they're so animalistic, or so shrill, or so
it's so profound,
and so dominating over the rest of her personality, not her personality, but of the sensibility within the poem, that they drown out other awareness or other possibilities. Okay, would you like to read one?
Yeah. Does anybody know whether the word G-I-B-B-E-T-S is a hard or a soft G? Is it gibbets? Or it's gibbets. Because I always pronounce it that way, but I'm not really sure. So the metaphor here is that Dickinson wrote a lot about maelstrom. That was a condition. She looked at the water in the ocean and she identified maelstrom, and it had powerful emotional quality for her. So this is about a maelstrom of agony. 'Twas like a maelstrom with a notch that nearer every day kept narrowing its boiling wheel until the agony toyed coolly with the final inch of your delirious hem, and you dropped lost when something broke and let you from a dream. Is it as if a goblin, yeah?
Yeah. No, I'll come back to you. Finish.
As if a goblin with a gauge, another measuring here, kept measuring the hours until you felt your second way helpless in his paws, and not a sinew stirred could help, and sense was setting numb when God remembered and the fiend let go then overcome. As if your sentence stood pronounced and you were frozen led from dungeon's luxury of doubt to gibbets and the dead. And when the film had stitched your eyes, a creature gasped reprieve. Which anguish was the utterest then, to perish or to live? It's one of her great poems. I love that poem. Which anguish was the utterest then? You know, that measuring, that, and also when God remembered. You know, she has a wonderful poem about an apple dropping from a tree. And again, God is involved in that, and the power of the sun is involved. And why is it that moment when it drops?
Also, if we look at some reciprocities with earlier poems, we looked at the tonal shift in the earlier poem we just read, and in stanza 2 it says, "Toyed coolly with the final inch of your delirious hem." That again might imply some transcendence or something of joy, of sensuousness, of sense even. But you dropped lost when something broke and let you from a dream. And that reminds me, this poem for some reason, its cadence reminds me of the very first poem, I Felt a Funeral in My Brain. And if you look here, you know, and you dropped lost when something broke, the last stanza in the first poem that we looked at, and then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down and down. So this notion of trying to rise up within the poem for a moment and then resuming a fall out of her control is running through a lot of these poems.
There's a wonderful line, I don't remember which poem it's in, but it's crisis is a hair. And that business of from one moment to the next, anything can happen. And that drop, there's a lot of that drop in her poetry. So, you know, you might want to read, because of, and when the film had stitched your eyes, you might want to read I Saw No Way, the heavens were stitched, because it'll give you a...
Could you just talk about it a little bit?
Sure.
I'm feeling very frustrated. I expected that you'd explain things, and I'm feeling, you know, like, who is your delirious man? Who is she talking to? And you drop lost.
I think it's a self-portrait of a state of mind and emotion, a very, very frightening. You know, she's a poem. One need not be a mansion to be haunted. It's about a sense of chaos, and you could speak to this, Doctor. I mean, It's about facing something.
It's interesting because literally seconds before you said that, it occurred to me that you know, the thing about her poetry is it's like rock music. I mean, you don't have to understand it to enjoy it.
No. It's also, you don't have to interpret it to enjoy it. It's not meant to interpret. It's
Mystery
meant.
is great.
Yeah, and it's a rush of images which which experiments, shocks, and surprises. They're precisely, each word is chiseled and chosen with great care, and she's describing what is going on in the mind of some person or some sensibility. She's describing a state of falling, a state of suffocation, a state of forgetfulness, a state which pushes meaning aside. It's a mood. Think if that's helpful to you. It isn't meant to be, nor are we capable of, nor should it be, interpreted image for image.
No, but I understand. Yeah. I understand your objection. I was hoping that by putting certain of these poems together, that thematically they would just announce themselves. For instance, the soul has bandaged moments, and at the end, the soul is a felon who's been, imprisoned. But just before the, the final punishment, when he's going to be murdered, someone says, "Oh, God remembers." It's "Oh no, don't assassinate that prisoner. Let him go."
It's more painful. It's more painful to.
Which anguish is worse? Coming up to that moment and then being let go and not knowing when again you'll be taken up in that same battle. Yeah. And here I think what you've got is this image of a maelstrom in the sea. I don't know how to physically. I'm not much of a scientist, but there is a rule to a maelstrom, and it has to play itself out. It's like being overtaken by something, a storm.
But doesn't sexuality make its way into this?
Oh yeah, all of them. I think. I mean, many of the great poems. It was like a maelstrom
within us that era every day kept narrowing its spoiling wheel until the agony.
Yeah. And then the image is
I don't know if it's exactly
with the final inch of your hem. Yeah. Agony is toying with you, like pulling at you. But she refers to it as your delirious hem. I mean, her adjectives are very, very vital and very, sometimes quite peculiar.
And then one sentence just, she has easier and harder poems. and she's a little bit of acquired taste, and the trick is right. I think to read some of the easier poems first, and then you kind of get a taste for her. At least that was my.
Because we were going to be here with the psychoanalysts, I wanted to dive right into the wreck.
Why don't you read this?
Go ahead, read it. Of her poems that I read. So if it's something you want to enter into, read some of her easier ones first, and then.
Yeah, if you get the Silver Book and you start at the beginning, these poems are really from a year in her life when she wrote almost 400 poems and was in the grip of something amazing. But they are among her strongest poems. And so the image here is there's a goblin, and the goblin is measuring the hours that this prisoner is going to live. And there's no help for this prisoner. And his or her sense is beginning to get numb. And then God remembers and says, "Oh, let her go. Let her go from that." And then the whole image is, then she moves to this image of the film. When the film had stitched her eyes, as if it were like a pageant that she was describing. Something you could just it's a drama. As if the film had stitched your eyes, and so anyhow.
Okay, one more question. And we'll have time at the end too, but go ahead.
Obviously, the more knowledge you have and the more sensitivity to the period, the better your interpretation is going to be. So I don't think it's just a matter of reading this. Is there any text, for example, does the 3-volume edition gloss any of these terms?
Well, what it will give you is the variance, you know, where she hadn't made up her mind about a critical poem.
The best thing is to use the Oxford English Dictionary and to...
So there is no edition. I mean, there's the collected poems. I have the poems of Emily Dickinson,
Right.
selected poems. So none of them actually have footnotes on individual works.
They won't give you commentary on the poems, but if you get the 3-volume Thomas Johnson...
Under $25.
No.
Oh, no. That's the 3-volume of Franklin.
Yeah, it's really great. And Franklin is a manuscript expert. I prefer Johnson. I mean, I think Franklin is expert, but Johnson, who really worked with the poems and all of his life.
One more question, and then we got it. Yeah.
No, I'm intrigued with your interpretation of this drama and the prisoner, but can you tell me where you get that there's a prisoner in here?
Well, he's in a dungeon. He or she is in a dungeon, so...
I think you're talking about different poems. She's not the male.
No, I'm talking about the maelstrom here.
Right.
So,
see, I think if you're in a dungeon...
At the conclusion, you're saying, from Dungeon's Luxury of Doubt.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like the...
And giblets are gallows.
Remember the poem, and even a report of land to justify despair? You know, the image is, if you were way out at sea and you saw that land and you knew you couldn't get to it, well, that would justify your despair. But you don't even have that.
This talked about the fact that in the Maelstrom book, you're rescued 3 times.
Yeah.
In this, the rhythm of this. Until the agony took coolly with that final inch, and you dropped lost when something broke and let you from the dream.
Right.
As if a goblin with a gauge and how a sinew stirred could help, and sense was getting on when God remembered.
Yeah.
And if your sentence stood pronounced and you were frozen, led from dungeon's luxury of doubt to gibbets and the dead. And when the film had stitched your eyes, a creature gasped reprieve.
Well,
and each one is more terrible than the next.
Right. That's right.
It's harrowing.
Right. And sometimes she's just writing about getting through it. What was the poem we read earlier about at the end? She,
first chill, then stupor.
Yeah. What happens when somebody freezes, and then letting go, and then letting go. So it's just sort of waiting it out, not for transcendence, but for some amount of relief or change or pause in it. There seems to be a pause, a break in her affliction, or in the way she's describing it. The next poem, I'd like to read a poem that is both, as you were suggesting. There's, I think, a brilliant little poem which is relatively simple and sticks with many of the things we've been discussing, and that is The Brain Within Its Groove.
And this should appeal to the medical faculty.
Yes. This is the great psychoanalytic poem that she wrote, and beautiful. Again, she speaks through this rush of images.
632 for those of you.
Yeah. Okay. The brain within its groove runs evenly and true, but let a splinter swerve. 'Twere easier for you to put a current back when floods have slit the hills and scooped a turnpike for themselves and trodden out the mills. What a delicate and a really remarkable, it opens with this brief description of some sort of a moment of tranquility. The brain runs true, a moment of tranquility, of steadiness, but one little splinter, one little scar.
Right, crisis is a hair.
A crisis is a hair, yeah. And then if something goes wrong, it's easier to push a whole current back. And the imagery of these grooves and currents and floods and turnpikes to where the end, trodden out the mills, is fabulous. What I see there, and I'm not even sure of this, trodden out the mills, which means that the current of despair, the current of chaos, is so large and has risen so high that mills would be something that functions, that works, that produces, that functions.
Right.
So, and it's not even visible, because it's the functioning self, or the working self, or the thinking self even, is not even visible. It's
a little town.
It's under, yeah, it's like a little, under the water. So here's an example. I think this is a great psychoanalysis.
And I love the lightness of touch with, and scooped a turnpike for themselves, as if this force, this assaultive force, had its own thing to do, and its own little greedy agenda. And then there's one that was on
split the hills, and also to end after that, and trodden out the mills. There's so many different ways she could say that, but nobody but her would say, and trodden out the mills.
Yeah.
I mean, that's...
Well, that's because that was one of the alternative words.
Yeah. And blotted out. I prefer trodden because it's so unexpected.
Well, this is why it's
the
worth
water
spending
would trod.
$125 on the 3 volumes, because there's actually...
We could take a vote.
The truth is, you can wake up and you can look at one poem, or 3 poems on a whole Saturday that have these variants, and just go off into this transfixing daydream.
What does it say again? Not trodden?
What does each one... How does each one alter the whole poem?
Blotted out the mills. That's a good one, but blotted, water might blot. Water never trod, you don't think of it.
Blotted out the mills.
And blotted out the mills. I think trodden is the more unexpected, more experimental.
Yeah. Does trodden mean that it actually builds the mills, or it destroys them?
It destroys them.
It destroys them. The term trodden might suggest something else.
No, I know, but my point is, this is her originality. This is the element of shock and surprise and the unexpected, which is her gift, which is her way of.
I think you were right when you said before, blotted kind of belongs more to floods. But the fact that she mixes it and has the floods trodding is part of her vitality as a poet, I think.
Was there another brain?
Yes, there was one that was on the subways. I was very happy to tell you, and that's the brain is wider than the sky. Here it is.
Now Now here too, this is a rather simple one, and I've tried to stress a lot. The brain is wider than the sky, and here I think she speaks most directly about the way in which really the self and the inner landscape is everything. The brain is wider than the sky, for put them side by side, the one the other will contain, with ease, and you beside. The brain is deeper than the sea, for hold them blue to blue, the one the other will absorb, as sponges buckets do. The brain is just the weight of God, for heft them pound for pound, and they will differ if they do, a syllable from sound.
You know what I would really suggest? You memorize some of these poems.
Yeah.
And they just seep into your skin, and they seep into your bloodstream, and they're mysterious and they're riddling, but they're so potent for that very reason. The brain is just the weight of God. Then somebody could say, well, we're just a prisoner of our own way of thinking. Yeah. I mean, that's a kind of hackneyed way of saying the brain is just the weight of God, but weigh them pound for pound, and they will differ if they do, as syllable from sound.
Isn't that sacrilegious?
Always.
Yeah.
It's transcendent.
She said, 2 years before she died, she said, consider the lilies of the field. It's the only commandment I ever obeyed.
Isn't it also transcendentalism?
Yeah, pardon?
Transcendent.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. She was a transcendentalist, I think. She was a real Emersonian.
Okay, would you like to read The Wind?
Yeah, now this one is, the image here is of the wind.
The
And
wind tapped like a tired.
The wind is like a man coming to knock on the door. And I think it's really dramatic and very funny and very modern. So the wind tapped like a tired man. And like a host, come in, I boldly answered, entered then my residence within. A rapid, footless guest, to offer whom a chair were as impossible as hand a sofa to the air. No bone had he to bind him. His speech was like the push of numerous hummingbirds at once from a superior bush. His countenance a billow, his fingers, as he passed, let go a music as of tunes blown tremulous in glass. He visited, still flitting, then like a timid man. Again he tapped, 'twas flurriedly, and I became alone. You know, it's one of her great phrases, I became alone. And it turns up in a number of poems.
This gentleman keeps talking about sexual imagery in her poems, and this is one poem. This reading of it, it seems we can't avoid it. It seems as if that something enters into her world, and then she's left alone.
Mm-hmm. And the sexual aspect, I think, is so gorgeously.
My residence within.
It's so deepened by my residence within.
Yeah. Come in,
so,
she says.
Come in.
Yeah.
Come in. It's a little different from Robert Frost.
His speech was like the push. Again, it's always the unexpected word, the unexpected image. His speech was like the push of numerous hummingbirds at once from a superior bush.
Not everybody is of the elect, but if you get this, if you get the wind coming in to yourself like this, you're of the elect.
And then to end,
I love that. A rapid, footless guest to offer whom a chair were as impossible.
oh yeah, that's great. That's right. Yeah.
As hand a sofa to the air. There's a poem that begins, how happy is the little stone that wanders in the road alone and doesn't think about careers and exigencies, never fears. And it's about it's a very Beckett-like poem about how wonderful it is to be anonymous and alone on the road and unnoticed. And it's a whole different tone to the way the word alone is in this poem.
This version has taken out the dashes and put in punctuation.
You know,
there's a lot of discussion of the dashes, but the dashes seem to have been very important to her, and they really are essential to her.
But again, I think that if Mabel Loomis Todd and Thomas Wentworth Higginson hadn't tidied up these poems, that people would have said, well, this is like Gertrude Stein. I mean, in that era, it just would have, they wouldn't have been read. They would have seemed too strange.
Is that what these were copied from?
Well, I don't know what version you have,
well,
but...
I've got the Johnson, not the Trayard, the one copy.
Johnson may have added a few commas, but he was pretty meticulous.
No, the commas are in the punctuation is in the printed version that was handed out, that was available on the table.
I don't know where
Johnson has all the
dashes.
Yeah.
Well, I think to feel calm about it, you should get the Johnson edition. You know, to feel confident.
My life has stood a loaded gun.
This is, I think, probably one of the hardest poems of Emily Dickinson's. And if any of you have insight into it, please, please speak up. Because I find this poem amazing.
Yeah. And you'll see right away there's a narrative to it, almost like a children's, nursery rhyme or something, or there's a folk element that really makes it's a real departure from the other poems we've written. And yet again, another surprise coming from her, another unexpected turn. My life has stood a loaded gun in corners till a day the owner passed, identified, and carried me away. And now we roam in sovereign woods, and now we hunt the doe. And every time I speak for him, the mountains straight reply. And do I smile, such cordial light, upon the valley glow? It is as a Vesuvian face had let its pleasure through. And when at night, our good day done, I guard my master's head, 'tis better than the eider duck's deep pillow to have shared to foe of his. To have shared. To foe of his, I'm deadly foe, none stir the second time. On whom I lay my yellow eye, or an emphatic thumb. Though I than he may longer live, he longer must than I, for I have but the power to kill without the power to die.
That's the life of an object.
Yeah, the life
Oh, wait.
Yeah. What I think this means is that it's a gun that carries the me or Dickinson away, and then her entire life afterward is defined by having the gun. And she has the power to kill because of it, but she can never die. The gun overpowers her in a sense.
Well, the owner of the gun carries her away.
But she's the gun.
She's the gun.
Yeah, well, like, she has the power to kill, but she doesn't have the power to die. It's kind of like she and the gun become confused and kind of meld into an awful object together.
In a lot of the emotional states, I think that's right. I think a lot of the emotional states she depicts are very, very complex, very true, very real. And one approach to this might be to say that really her awareness is that good and evil are in a way the same, are inseparable. I think that's what you're trying to say. And
well, because it's such a tender poem,
that's right. It's both a violent and a tender. The language is tender.
I've shared his pillow.
Yeah.
Mike, there's been a question I had.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Where?
Yeah. This lady in the green.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I just want to really delightful to hear you and hear your enthusiasm. I was just thinking maybe it's about her own power, because she says that she's the owner of the gun, and it's about her, like she's guarding.
She is the gun.
She says, to foe of her will, I'm deadly foe. None will stir the second time if they, oppose her will. And I think the gun maybe represents her will. Her power, maybe it's her powers.
The will is a good choice. But who's the owner? Is the owner a deity?
No, I think she is.
No,
she doesn't identify herself as the owner.
Okay.
I think she is the gun, and the gun is her power of speech and her power of poetry.
Because that's not. Then there's no power to die there. That's the immortality of the verse.
How about this? How about that the owner is the one to whom she could give love and passion. The owner is the one to whom she's obsessed, and the owner is one that perhaps she sits in seclusion and isolation, thinking their relationship, or if his, that's sort of how I read it. I mean, if that's helpful, I don't know, but that it's sort of all her love affairs, most of them took place. Well, somebody said of her, I think they said she married herself. She was married to herself, and but she was obsessional, and she was very deeply involved with many men and women that she met. And this poem seems almost like an allegory to me. I'm not sure of this, and I just throw it out if it's useful, of the power of fantasy love or an imagined love.
To the power to kill her own feelings.
The power to kill her own feelings, the violence inherent in it, the importance of having a fantasy relationship or an unrequited relationship, the dependency, the need for it, even though it's unrequited and it can never come into reality.
I think it's just about power.
Power.
Yeah.
Some
Yeah,
people have interpreted the poem that the owner is her self-awareness, and that the loaded gun is her rage, her instinct,
very good,
her
yeah.
body,
Yeah.
and that's what never dies at the end. I mean, that
yes, right.
will always be there. So
that's a good
also,
answer.
to talk about the sexual implication, this poem, I mean, is just filled.
It's filled with aggression, frustration.
She very rarely mentions dreaming.
Yeah.
She goes straight into the dream state without saying that.
And where does this come from? To foe of his and deadly foe, none stir the second time?
Again, her power.
I kill.
Yeah, yeah, but that's...
There's a woman back.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, go.
Young lady.
Yeah.
I also kind of wonder that it might not be her struggle with God.
With God?
Because of the, well, there's a couple of hymn references, a couple of things that are slightly adapted from hymn lyrics. The Mountain's Straight Reply. There are a few of those references that I almost wonder if the owner is, if she's taking the power of life and death rather than giving it to God.
I think that's really smart.
If there's a struggle there, and I'm not saying that she has a clear answer to that, but that could be a part of her existential struggle of wondering if it really is just me in the end, or if there is a greater power, or if who is the owner? Am I the owner of my life, or is God the owner of my life?
Yeah, and she refers to the word master is very interesting, although, refresh my memory, were there letters at the end or poems where she wrote about a master, the master?
There were 3 poems that were, three letters that were addressed to a master, and they were incredible, actually.
Yeah. These were men that these were...
No, they don't really know.
Yeah.
But that would have been also in the religious tracts of the day. Master would have been a common.
That's right.
Religious reference.
And she chose it for that reason, but I think when she wrote about it in her letters, she rather than use the specific names of people that she was obsessed with and fall in love with in the silence of her room, in the solitude of her room, she began to use the word master in several places I saw it. And so...
Right. Up at the Dickinson house, you can buy the 3 letters that were addressed to the master.
To the master, you know, and yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think she was a pretty playful person, and I think sometimes I take little poems, but she must. Alice would know that she must have written 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 or 15 poems about objects.
Yeah.
Where personifying objects. What the hell? I'll just take one as a gun and just go there. And, and then she gives us the opportunity to read everything we want to in the 21st century children. But she is having a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think too, I mean, we've been looking at the poem as though when she says my and I, that that's referring to her, the actual poet. And I'm not sure that's true.
Oh,
yeah.
I mean,
I would say that
this gentleman's comment is sort of connected with that this is playing with an object, an image. You know, it's not so directly autobiographical or even necessarily referring to her own emotions, Emily Dickinson. It's an I that's a poetic I.
But it's hard not to imagine that the poems describe such vivid states that it would be hard to assume that she hadn't experienced those.
I'd like to
strong.
You know, as we discuss this, I feel, for whatever reason, that I kind of want to repeat my interpretation. It still stays with me that it seems to be the master in her. I still read it more emphatically, you know, as the relationship of a fantasy of her solitude, her solitary self, with a fantasy relation. The need to have the fantasy, the need for the energy, the need for the vitality of imagining a relationship that wasn't going to happen. So we have to move on.
I think she still had those relationships, however they proceeded. Yeah. I think she had them. If we don't have much time, maybe we should go to the end. Probably everybody knows I heard a fly buzz when I died, right? Stillness in the room. It was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm.
Well, why don't we say,
Want to go straight to, I think I was enchanted? I think the drama in this poem is so interesting because the speaker is describing what is happening while he or she is dying. So, and just the opening lines are so incredible. Yeah. I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. The eyes around had wrung them dry, and breaths were gathering firm for that last onset when the king be witnessed in the room. Like death, right? I love that. When the king be witnessed in, I willed my keepsake, signed away what portion of me be assignable, and then there interposed a fly with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me, and then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see. Again, I think reference to Anthem, From Sea to Sea. I really appreciate your mentioning the mountains replying. I think
she must have watched, as many people have been saying, she watched many people die. She was very, very, she must have seen many, many people die. And here she tries to put all of those observations. And the interesting part is she imagines her own death, but the interesting part is it's sort of less horrifying than those she had to witness and watch. It's harder, it's more terrifying so this poem in a way isn't as horrifying as having to witness or to watch something.
Well, I mean, it's not horrifying also because of that fly, that ordinary little fly.
As a comic element and an earthy element, and
as life goes on,
comic relief.
Falling from the sky in the background.
Yeah. You know, one of the things I think, it's so exciting to enter into the description of these states. And there's a poem that begins, I've never seen volcanoes, but when travelers tell about them, and she goes on, and she says, if the stillness is volcanic in the human face, when upon a pain titanic features keep their place. I mean, she's just very aware of containment, and it's thrilling.
The fly, which you mentions, is both comic and it accentuates the stillness of the room, and in its own almost comic way,
and the reverence of that moment.
It's life. Yeah. It's life. It's buzzing. It's going on while this in the midst of this grief. Yes, somebody way in the back there.
There's a fly in a Dunn poem. A Dunn poem.
Oh yeah.
In which I wish I remembered. In which the speaker is courting the beloved, and he says, "Why does this fly have more freedom than I do to roam over your body?" And I was going to ask if you thought that in that library, her fathers, there were metaphysical poets like John Donne and Andrew Marvell, Elizabeth Smith, because certainly the surprise, the shock element, the reversal, very similar.
You know, I wish I know, of course, that T.S. Eliot was, you know, made everybody completely aware of the importance of the metaphysical poets, as they were called. I don't know whether they were popular at the time. She talks about reading Keats, Browning, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Shakespeare, Sir Thomas Browne, the naturalist. Shakespeare I mentioned, the dictionary. I don't remember
heard
a
many
reference,
critics, I don't know if she read, many critics compare her, see a similarity with Donne, and have mentioned, I think in the realm of the in ecstasy or very, very intense experience, very delicately or very precisely captured.
And she did, after all, live in a college town, and they were very close to the, you know, very of the college.
She ever mentioned Poe? There's so much echo of Poe in the poetry.
Yeah.
I think she did read Poe, Charles.
And people have mentioned Blake, and it's sort of almost like a self-taught or a primitive kind of.
Mabel Loomis Todd, in the first edition of her poems, compares her to Blake. And,
Alice, not making comparisons, and we're reaching towards the end.
Yeah.
I'll throw a Hail Mary out.
Oh, God. Oh, watch out, Alice.
You know, any sense at all in any comparisons of Dickinson with Kafka? To the extent that they recused themselves, to the extent that their careers were reconstituted in absentia, you know, I mean, as a career, looking at the totality.
and also, what about the drama? Dearest Father, you ask why I maintain I am afraid of you. I mean, she was very unafraid to go into that.
Well,
but we should the fly in some sense, and maybe it's already been alluded to some extent, represent a continuation of her in a certain essence.
Yes, yes.
Because when you take if you read the third stanza, I willed my keepsake sign away what portions of me be assignable.
Right.
And then it was, there interposed a fly carrying off the unassignable aspects.
Yeah.
The essence.
Why don't we do two more? And then
we have to do the Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Right?
Which one is that?
I think I was enchanted.
Okay, why don't you read that? Maybe this will be the last one, or maybe one more after this. Okay.
There's a short Shakespearean poem that's very, very dark, and I thought we could hear that one, and then one last poem, which is about Emily Dickinson reading Elizabeth Barrett Browning for the first time and becoming enchanted with poetry itself. So the really dark poem, the Shakespearean poem, is, which she wrote just a couple of years before she died. By homely gift and hindered words, the human heart is told of nothing. Nothing is the force that renovates the world. By homely gift and hindered words, the human heart is told of nothing. Nothing is the force that renovates the world. I think that's a very Shakespearean poem. And the poem about Elizabeth Barrett Browning, which I love, do many of you know Amy Clampett's poetry? Amy wanted this read at her funeral, and I read this at her funeral, and I felt that it was, you know, she was feeling that there was a continuity, Elizabeth Barrett Browning to Dickinson, you know, to her. And it begins, I think I was enchanted when first a somber girl, I read that foreign lady, the dark was beautiful. And whether it was noon at night or only heaven at noon, for very lunacy of light, I had not power to tell. The bees became as butterflies, the butterflies as swans, approached and spurned the narrow grass, and just the meanest tunes that nature murmured to herself to keep herself in cheer, I took for giants practicing Titanic opera. The days to mighty meters stepped, the homeliest adorned, as if unto a jubilee, 'twere suddenly confirmed. I could not have defined the change. Conversion in the mind, like sanctifying in the soul, is witnessed, not explained. 'Twas a divine insanity, the danger to be sane. Should I again experienced, 'tis antidote to turn to tomes of solid witchcraft. Magician be asleep, but magic hath an element like deity to keep.
Well, this is a great poem to end on, isn't it?
It's about falling in love with poetry.
Yeah.
So. Anyway.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for all of your insights.
Yeah.
Thank you for your insights.